Welcome to 2025, the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We appreciate you guys coming. This is the first show we've done of the year, and welcome to it. And we have a good one today, folks. We have a lot to talk about here, and especially on this particular day, heading into the new year. We had just last night, we had dueling commentary by the New Year's Eve broadcast by Vladimir Putin of Russia and Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. Each kind of laid out their vision for what they want to do in the coming year. Both sounded very confident and optimistic about where things are going to go for the war. We're going to take a look at what they each said in that, but then we're also going to take a look at each of them over the last several weeks have kind of given us clues as to how they intend to accomplish that objective in 2025. And then we're going to take a look at what ground truth reality looks like and see which of these two visions has the best chance of success into the future. And we got nobody better to help us unpack a lot of this than Larry the Shirt Johnson, former CIA analyst and author at sonar21.com, friend of the show. Larry, first of all, Happy New Year and welcome to the show.
Same to you and Gary and the whole crew.
We really appreciate it. Yeah. And I've been looking forward to having you on here because one of the things we love to having you on about here is that you kind of cut through the BS of no matter who's saying it, whether it's Putin, Zelensky, Biden, Trump, anybody else, to say, all right, here's the real deal. And that's what our viewers, I think, come to value and what we're certainly going to show them today. So let's first start off on the Russian side and take a look at what Putin has said. And then we're going to do kind of in a rapid force here. We're going to show you sort of lightning round. Here's one thing you said. What are your response? And then we'll go to the next one and see what kind of picture we paint here. First of all, here's last night, Vladimir Putin talking about the future in 2025.
Our country, independent, free, and strong, has risen to meet the most difficult challenges. And now, on the threshold of the new year, we look to the future. We are confident that everything will be well and we will move forward. We know for certain that the destiny of Russia and the well-being of its citizens have been, are, and always will be our highest priorities.
So it's interesting here, and you're going to see this in a minute. So both leaders talked about that their confidence and that they focused on their people. But we'll see if the visions match up with that. But one of the first things I thought interesting about the Putin's version of this was that he spent very little time talking about the war. Why do you suppose that might have been?
Well, because he sees it in the broader context of Russia's overall strength. Remember, he apparently hasn't gotten the neocon memos that he's got fatal diseases, everything from Parkinson's, cancer, heartbreak of psoriasis, and that the Russian economy is in tatters, that they're on the verge of collapse at any moment. What comes across with Putin is he's been around for 25 years now and has taken Russia literally from the dumps, from depression, from chaos, and he's built it into now, I would argue, the strongest military power in the world, stronger than the United States.
Well, and that's really saying a lot of things. And of course, there'll be very few people in the West who will believe that because we have been inundated with, we'll politely say, a certain spin. You could also use the word propaganda, that Russia is fatally weakened, that in fact, they're a lot worse today than they were before, because as Secretary of Defense Austin said early in the war, that was an outright objective of ours. You don't hear that as much anymore, but still the understanding is that, and in fact, I hear this among many, even good analysts. They say, oh, that they're trash. They haven't learned anything from the war. That's why they're going so slow. They can't win anything. They would never be able to go against the West. There may be some truth to that part, but we'll see how this...
Danny, they're failures. They can't build a $200 million aircraft. They can't build a $13 billion aircraft carrier. Theirs come in far less. They spend far less money on it. So, see, obviously they're failures. I mean, that's how crazy we've become. Oh, yeah, they've invented 3 different hypersonic missiles. We can't even do one. Yeah, they're terrible.
Yeah, and of course, from my own personal experience in the future combat systems in the early 2000s, we spent scores of billions of dollars and produced nothing of consequence, went on to another platform after that. And to this day, that was in 1998, 1999, I think, when they announced the Future Combat System, the Chief of Staff of the Army. And now, a quarter of a century later, we don't have anything to replace the 1980s Abram tanks anyway. I'm sorry. That's a sore point for me. So I wanted to pile on with that. But let's look back at the Russia situation. So one of the things that Putin has said in recent days that was the discussion among many, some on the Ukraine side, some on the U.S. side, is that, hey, the reason why they went into Kursk last August was because they wanted to carve out this area, and now they're going to use it as a negotiating tool to hand that over to Putin so that they can get something else elsewhere on the front line. Here's what Putin said about that recently.
They will push the enemy out, that's for sure. And after that, we will be able to evaluate the damage, to assess. And after that, you can be sure that everything will be restored. There can be no doubt about that. We will restore the utility infrastructure, the highways, social objects, schools, kindergartens, and of course, we will restore housing.
Now, I want to ask you something on that because I have no doubt that the intention or the desire on the part of Ukraine and the West would be to, hey, we've grabbed this out. Now let's use this as a negotiating chip and say, all right, I'll give you this, and then you give me back here. But I mean, honestly, aside from what Putin actually said there, from your perspective, it would almost seem to me to be like a slap in the face to the Russian people if Putin were to actually say, okay, instead of us conquering this, we're going to just take it back in negotiations and give something else away that we have elsewhere. How would that play out in Russia? You've been there before.
Yeah, no, they're not going to negotiate. I mean, they don't need to make concessions. They're not like a guy that has to restructure finances in order to hang on to his house. They're winning, and so, Putin's negotiating position as it's evolved over the last 3 years. When you go back to March of 2022, at that point, they were saying, okay, look, Ukraine, you can hang on to Donetsk and Luhansk. You can retain control of that. They didn't even mention about the Zaporizhia or Kherson. But then after the rejection of that Russian peace proposal in March of 2022, Russia's position hardened and they had the elections. So Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia all became part of Russia. And not temporarily, they are part of Russia. And then in the last 6 months, we've heard Putin start to use the term Novorossiya. Novorossiya is a word that goes back to the days of the Tsar, and that entire area of eastern Ukraine is really considered part of Russia, not something just attached recently. In fact, it was part of Russia before there ever really was a Ukraine. Ukraine only started showing up on maps around 1908, 1909. This was well into the 19th century, going back even to the 18th century. So Putin's, he's not playing with it, and that's the problem. And I know you've made this point over and over and over. The West doesn't get it. They're not listening to him. They need to listen.
Well, and here's one more thing that they apparently need to listen to, and we'll caveat this by saying, anytime you hear a statement from any leader, and that is Vladimir Putin, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, certainly Zelensky, any of them, you have to take it with a grain of salt, and you have to say, okay, that's what you're saying, but how does that match up on the ground? So tell me how what Putin's commentary here about the course of the war lines up to what we see.
Our army is progressing. They're making advances, and the enemy cannot hold the positions. They withdrew, they organized some defenses, but they cannot hold those defenses, because tomorrow there will be the next advance. So they cannot stop our army.
Is that an exaggeration, or is that truth?
No, it's very true. This is kids. This is why it's important to study math, addition, subtraction when you're in elementary school, because it does come into play here later in life. And when you sit down and do the addition, Russia's manpower in its army has grown from 300,000 to 1.5 million over the course of the last 3 years, whereas Ukraine's has shrunk from around 750,000 down to around 300,000. So they're going in the opposite directions. In terms of artillery shells, Russia's got at least an 8-to-1, 10-to-1 advantage, both in artillery shells, artillery pieces. Ditto for tanks. Ditto, there isn't even a comparison when it comes to dropping these FABs, these bombs that are launched from a distance and they glide into targets. And they started at the low level at 500 kilograms. It's over 1,000-pound bomb, and go all the way up to something on the magnitude of 6,000 pounds. And Ukraine doesn't even have an answer for that. Ukraine doesn't have an air force. Ukraine doesn't have any kind of rotary wing fleet to move troops around. On drones, they're outnumbered. There is not a single area in that which Ukraine can point to, say, we've got more of this than Russia, except to say, we got more aid from NATO than Russia gets. That's true. They get more aid from NATO, but they're suffering on the manpower front, and Russia is just steadily moving westward, and Ukraine can't stop them.
So in light of Putin's comment last night about how they plan to go to success, and Putin's previous comments I just showed you there about that our offense, our military is moving forward, theirs can't stop us and can only go backwards. With that confidence, it seemed, then here was Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov addressing something here just, I think, a week or so ago, in that the so-called Kellogg plan that Trump is going to be coming into, that has been widely discussed as being what he's going to try to do to end the war, which was primarily, and by the way, for those who may not know, General Keith Kellogg has been designated basically the czar for Russia-Ukraine war, as he's coming in, special representative, I think they call it. And he has said basically that we're going to delay NATO for at least a decade, maybe longer. We're going to freeze the line on the current line of contact, but the Ukraine side won't get those territories back, or the Crimea, et cetera. So on the one hand, it seemed like, all right, we're giving some concessions here. But on the Russian side, they're like, no, to your point, I think they're saying, no, you're not tracking. We're not giving any concessions on any of these major things. And so that's why one of the key factors that the Kellogg plan calls for is an immediate ceasefire. And here's what Lavrov said about that.
We cannot be satisfied with empty talk. So far, all we've heard is talk about the need to come up with some kind of truce. And it's not particularly hidden that this truce is needed in order to gain time to continue pumping weapons into Ukraine. A truce is a road to nowhere.
Now, I would like to specifically use that comment because I know it's something that you've talked about before, and I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit for some of our audience who may not know, because on the surface of it, it sounds, okay, well, that makes sense. You have a you have a ceasefire, then you have negotiations a la Korea, 1952, 53, et cetera. But you say that when the Russians hear ceasefire, they're not thinking right now, they're among many things, they're going back to like 2014, 2015, when there were ceasefires, whatever, which froze the conflict, which allowed the Ukraine side to build up forces. So it's like they're not trusting us.
Yeah, well, neither you nor I were born when the Korean War came to a quote, an end. But part of the reason it came to an end is it was a genuine stalemate. The United States could not push the Chinese out. The Chinese were fully backing the North Koreans. So the U.S. Army was and the Marine Corps taking significant casualties. And we said, okay, let's call a halt. This isn't going anywhere. And we've had a frozen conflict there for my entire life. I turned 70 next month. So for over 70 years, we've had this frozen conflict with everybody's finger on this hair trigger. Russia's not going for that. Not at all. They don't need to. They're not falling back at any juncture. They're not retreating at any point. They're not seeing that the defense industry is being overwhelmed by the economic power of the West. They're seeing just the opposite. The economic power of the West is in collapse. It's in recession. Germany in particular. United States can't, it no longer makes attack of missiles. And it makes 550 Patriot missiles a year. And good God, Ukraine will go through that many in a week sometimes. So at no point is the West industrial capability capable of fighting modern war. We're used to fighting the crippled kids on the playground. The ones that are in wheelchairs and can't move around. That's who we're good at. we're good at beating up on the
Well,
weak.
I'm not sure I'd go that far because the so-called kids in the wheelchair, Taliban, are still in power today in Afghanistan.
yeah.
We aren't. So there's that. Let's just
Yeah.
add that to the
Well,
list.
I forgot, and those Houthis, I mean, they've driven our aircraft carriers out of the Red Sea 2 or 3 times, and again, we're going to reopen the Red Sea. So I mean, my frustration, I know that you shared it as well, is at some point can we have like a reality session in Washington D.C. and everybody sit down and say, hey guys, look, yeah, we're spending almost $1 trillion on our defense, and basically it sucks. Our equipment isn't that good. We're way behind technologically. We've basically designed our defense strategy around 20th century concepts that are not taking into account the 21st century. So we need to start all over.
Yeah, and I'd go so far as to say not even 20th century, because that included World Wars I and II. It's more like the latter decade where defense industrial base especially is designed for counterinsurgency warfare.
Yeah.
We cannot wage a modern existential fight against a peer or near peer. We just can't do it. But so that is probably not lost on the Russians as well. And so one of the other key aspects of the Kellogg plan was that we would, quote, put off the talk of NATO for 10 years. Now, one can say, all right, well, Trump's only got 4 years that he can even be in office, so he'll be long gone before that ever comes up. So he's just like, yeah, we're just not going to worry about that. Russians, on the other hand, according to Vladimir Putin, do.
I don't know what they are saying right now in the new upcoming team of the next American president, but in 2021, President Biden back then proposed exactly that. He said that they would postpone the ascension of Ukraine to NATO for the next 10 years because it was not ready. And I responded, yes, it wasn't ready. But what you will do is you will prepare it and then make it part of NATO. So it's actually not that long of a period. For us, it doesn't matter whether it's 1 year or 10 years. In historical terms, that's not so much. And I don't know if that is the true opinion of the Trump's team. But what's the difference between the proposals that you shared right now and the proposals of Biden's old administration? I don't know how the situation is going to develop going further and what the orders will be given by President Trump to his administration, but we will see.
So in the event that it comes down to that, can the Trump administration and the cumulative West say, no, that's our hard, fast, no pin line. We will have NATO on the ticket later on, or there's no deal. Can we do that?
Oh, we can do that, but they're not going to get a deal with Russia, and Russia's not going to go along with it. The problem, the West has completely discredited itself when it comes to agreements. Who was it that walked away from the anti-ballistic missile treaty agreement? Oh, that was the United States under George W. Bush. Who was it that walked away from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement? That would be Donald Trump. He walked away from that. Who would it be that violated Minsk I, Minsk II, having guaranteed that this would bring an end to the conflict in Ukraine, and then later only to reveal that, yeah, it was just a ploy by West Germany and France to give an excuse to rebuild Ukraine so it could go to war with Russia. Again, that was the Germans and the French. So from the Russian standpoint, and particularly Vladimir Putin, you realize they've been played quite a bit over the last 25 years. The Russians take these agreements seriously. An example of that is at the start of the special military operation, they had an agreement in place with Ukraine to allow natural gas to be to cross in a pipeline through Ukraine that goes to Slovakia, Austria, and Hungary. You'd think in a war, we're going to cut that off. Damn it, and we're not going to pay you any money. No, the Russians had a signed agreement with Ukraine. They paid them $1 billion a year, and they kept the gas flowing. It was only today that Ukraine on its own ended that agreement. We don't want your stinking Russian rubles, and stop the gas flow. They've cut their nose off to spite their own face. But the point of that is that even with an enemy, even with a country that they're at war with, Russia will honor its agreements. What Russia sees from the West is a group of people that do not honor agreements. Their word means nothing.
And so we'll see what that potentially translates into. This is from back in June, but it's been repeated here recently, just within the last couple of weeks, by Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, as well as Sergei Lavrov, that here is the apparently no pen line for the Russian side of this is the minimum standard that we'll even entertain a discussion with.
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
So now it's interesting here. That seems like a maximalist view. In fact, let me just real quick kind of show. I've shown this to people before, but for those who may be new to our channel, let me just show you. When he says the 4 oblasts, it's all the stuff in red, but it's also this thatched area, or this gray area right here, which the Ukraine side still possesses. So for there to be a negotiated end, the Ukraine side would have to voluntarily withdraw all their troops from there, or the Russian side will continue moving forward into that zone. But here's the question. If the West doesn't agree to that, can he continue to go on? Because based on all the things we've shown about the confidence of the Russia, about them saying that they're moving forward, the Ukraine side can't prevent them continuing to move forward. There's not going to be any NATO. There's not going to be any ceasefire. There's going to be this deal. That's one level of stuff. But I'd like your commentary specifically on a separate, but definitely related issue, is that I've seen a lot of commentary from like Russian Telegram channels and some of the other media that there seems to be a pretty strong desire upon the Russian side to saying, are you kidding me? Only those 4 oblasts with all that we paid, i.e. apparently there's a segment of the Russian population that's not even enough. They want Odessa and they want Kharkiv as well. And they want a whole lot more in between those two things. How do you see that playing out? And how does Putin have to balance internal discussions and issues with his own people who want more? And can he successfully negotiate on those lines of June 15th?
Right. Well, that's why I made the point about his use of the term Novorossiya, because Novorossiya does encompass Kharkiv, does encompass Odessa. And so either the West has a choice to make with Ukraine, that they accede to what Putin has demanded. They stop the fighting in the 4 oblasts right now, pull the troops out, and agree that the path for Ukraine to join NATO is closed permanently, that the West will no longer conduct military exercises with Ukraine in any form or fashion, and that Ukraine will be not aligned with the West. Now, the West is not going to do that. They should, but they won't. And so Russia will just keep rolling until they reach the Dnieper River. And nothing the West can do to stop it. Nothing that Ukraine can do to stop it. And they will take Odessa by force at some point.
So is your contention that, yes, Russia laid that out as like said, all right, here's our negotiating position, because on the one hand, that seems like a bold ask, but something that could be done, believing that the Trump administration / Zelensky won't be able to agree to a negotiated settlement that offers or that concedes territory that they haven't lost militarily. And so when we don't agree to it, then they say, all right, we'll just keep going. But their intention, is that what I'm hearing, that their intention is always to go up to the Dnieper, to the so-called Novorossiya?
No, actually, I don't think that was not their original intention. But I think that they've come now to, over the course of the last 3 years, with the conduct of the West, the fact that it has been the one constantly crossing red lines, it's a thing, doing things that they said they'd never do, supplying Abrams tanks, supplying attacking missiles, long-range attacking missiles that can strike deep into Russia, along with Storm Shadow and Scout missiles, claiming that they wouldn't do it, and then they did it. At the same time, working directly with terrorist organizations, including Islamic extremists like ISIS, to try to subvert Russian interests around the world, and as well as to carry out terrorist attacks inside Russia. So the Putin is sort of reflecting the growing impatience of the Russian population and saying, we've followed the law long enough. It's time to take the gloves off.
Okay, so let me ask you a question here. So, let me scale back a little bit here. So, obviously, this is what's happened in nearly 3 years now. We're literally a month away from 3 years of this war. Now, this is the Dnieper River right here. Here's Kharkiv up here. Here's Odessa over here. They would have to retake Kherson City, Mykolaiv, Odessa, and then, obviously Zaporizhia City, et cetera. That's a lot of territory when they have only taken this much so far. How long might it take the Russians to actually make good on that? And do you see them having the wherewithal and the domestic political steam to take that much more territory?
Well, again, we judge the pace of their movement by our own standards. And yet, if we're going to be honest about our own standards, we failed in Afghanistan. And we weren't up against Afghan tank units with artillery and fixed air power and ISR provided by NATO. The Russians are. And so what the Russians are doing is, one, to attrit those forces without having to do the head-on attacks that the U.S. Marines did on places like Okinawa, where they suffered significant casualties. It was the Army tactics, U.S. Army, when it came in and took over sectors that the Marines had held. The Army had a different approach. They used more of let's attrit the enemy and use artillery and other standoff weapons. That's what Russia's doing. Russia's they're not under a clock. There's not like, it's not like the fourth quarter and they got the 2-minute warning and they got to score a touchdown in the next 2 minutes or else they lose the game. No, they're content to bleed out Ukraine and NATO in the process. I think it was only probably at the start of 2003 that they came to the realization, hey, we're bleeding out NATO. We thought NATO would have been potentially, have a large reservoir of supplies that they could continue to pump in here. Found out, nope, paper tigers. They talk a good game, but they don't have the industrial capabilities to sustain. So that's, Russia's in no rush. Russia's in no rush.
Is it fair to say that it doesn't have to be over? I saw some commentary this morning on some of the Russian media that are speculating that Putin would like to have this wrapped up by 9 May for the obvious reasons for the end of the 80th anniversary, I think, of the win of the Second World War that they call the Great Patriotic War. That seems kind of optimistic. You would almost have to have just the surrender of the Ukraine of all those territories willingly to do so to get it by them, because otherwise, if what you're saying is accurate, they would have to say, yeah, and if we went on another 6 months, 9 months, we'll continue doing that. Do you think there's the domestic political will within Russia to go another 9 months if it took that?
No, there's no evidence yet of domestic political discontent saying this has got to stop, bring it to an end quick. None of that. Not like we did see that in the United States at the end of World War II, particularly in the war in the Pacific. There was growing pressure to get this over with quick. We don't want to sustain losses, even though we hadn't really suffered any significant losses. So that's the Russians. If you recall, it was last year as they came up on the May 8th, the March of the Immortals. They were saying the same thing then. Yeah, true. Putin wants to get this over by, May 8th. They're not driven by a deadline. And that's where I think we make a real mistake in the West. But they are making progress. There's a difference between being stalled out and, not able to advance. Whereas, you're biding your time. You're reducing the casualties of your forces. That's the thing people aren't paying attention to, and that's not the Russians saying it. It's the British media outlet, Media Zona, that's been tracking this, and they've been showing diminished casualties on the part of the Russians over the last 6 months, even though the pace of fighting has expanded dramatically. What is taking place is in 2024, the Ukrainians lost over 500,000 men killed and wounded. That is, they've lost as many in 1 year as they lost in the preceding 2 years. So they're on. I mean, it's an enormous loss. They can't sustain it.
But now let me look back at the map here, because you talk about the reduction in Russian casualties to achieve greater offensive. But if you start now saying, okay, look, we're going to go into Odessa, and I mean, you see that's a huge city, and to get to there, you have to go through, like I said, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, and several of these other cities. I mean, those aren't small. And then, of course, you talk about Kharkiv, which is, what is it, like 1 million people or something like that? I mean, it's enormous. And it would seem to actually take all of these areas, even in the full calendar year 2025, would be an enormous cost in manpower, because you would have to, these are infantry fights. There's no easy way to get that done. Can Russia increase the level of its casualties and maintain its whatever it is, around 30,000 or so troops being recruited per month? That would seem to be a challenge.
Yeah, well, the one thing Russia hasn't done up to this point, that if they were in a total war, you would anticipate they'd do this. Taking down every bridge every crossing across the Dnieper. Take it down. They've got the ability to do it. They may have to use some tactical nukes. You destroy all the bridge crossings.
Wait. Tactical nukes, that would kind of change the nature, don't you think?
Yeah, but you're gonna take out the bridges. So if you're not killing population, if you're just destroying, a small yield nuke that's going to destroy a bridge. I'm just saying, they've got these kinds of options, but you take those bridges out. How does Ukraine supply an army that's now cut off? You don't need to attack a city. You don't need to attack a city head on at that point. You cut it off. You surround it.
On that point, that's something that I admit has perplexed me from the beginning, is why Russia didn't take those bridges down before. Yeah. Now, I've heard some people say, oh, well, because they thought they were going to need them to go back over. You could build pontoon bridges for that. But the benefit of exactly what you described, of how it would make it so much more difficult for the Ukraine side to keep all of these fights going, it seems to me, just militarily speaking, they should have dropped these things 2 years ago, but they never have. And I wonder if you have any insight into that.
Well, because if your military plan says, okay, we want to attrit these guys, we want them to come running at us and fight us until we can kill as many of them as possible. And in the process, suck up all their ammunition, suck up all their artillery rounds. So therefore, we're going to keep the avenues open so that they can do that. It sounds, you're going, God, who could plan? But that's what's been happening. So I can only conclude that apparently was the objective. That, because remember, Putin was very clear in his statement: demilitarize and denazify. Well, how do you demilitarize? Because if you destroy one part of the army and it's on the east side of the Dnieper, but you leave the other half in place on the west side of the Dnieper, well, then that means you still got to cross that Dnieper again at some point and fight them. Hey, keep the bridges up. Y'all come. Oh, we got a really weak spot over here. I hopefully you don't attack that. They've read Brer Rabbit.
Well, that's an interesting analogy. Okay, so that's the situation on the Russian side here. Let's shift gears now and see, because you've talked about a lot of things that matches up, as I keep showing the map there. A lot of the things you said, their confidence seems to be well placed. Let's take a look at the Ukraine side and see where they are heading into 2025, now approaching the 3-year mark of the war. So here is Zelensky's a portion of his New Year's speech, which was curiously quite long, where he's talking about how the Ukraine people will succeed.
May 2025 be our year, the year of Ukraine. We know that peace will not be given to us as a gift, but we will do everything to stop Russia and end the war. This is what each of us wishes for. Behind all of us stands Mother Ukraine, and she deserves to live in peace. I wish this to all of us. And as the President of Ukraine, as well as a citizen, I will do everything to achieve it in the coming year, knowing that I will not be alone. I know that you stand shoulder to shoulder with me, millions of Ukrainians, strong, free, beautiful, independent. Happy New Year, dear people. Happy New Year, Ukraine.
Okay, that one's a little harder to match on a map. How do you just generally, before we get into some of the specifics, how do you see his comments there? And even a better question, to the extent that you're able, if you're a Ukrainian person anywhere in Ukraine, how do those words strike you?
I would have found the video more convincing if they'd been playing some, Jerry Garcia, the Grateful Dead, driving this train high on cocaine. That's what he's doing. He's out of touch with reality. That kind of happy talk doesn't deal with the fact that they are not able to replace the men that are dying and being wounded on the front lines right now with trained recruits. They are able to grab a few people, stuff them into the back of vans and cars. But, as you and I have talked about this before, you're looking at a minimum of probably an 18-month training cycle in order to have a unit that's now, even though inexperienced, at least marginally qualified to go into combat on this kind of industrial battlefield.
Yeah, and then let me jump in on that there, because that is something I've been saying literally since the opening of the war, and I think is so critical for people to understand, because it's not intuitive if you've not been in the military. That 18-month period, by the way, is I think I exactly cited that as the minimum, the absolute minimum, that you take somebody who's untrained and to form a coherent unit that can fight coordinated on a battlefield. You would have to have that kind of training. And the most anybody's getting right now, according to all the reports I get, especially from the Ukraine side, they might get some weapon familiarization and they might not. Yeah. And they're shoved up to the front. So no matter what this number is, they're constantly starting from scratch each and every month.
Right. Well, and I'm a firearms instructor, and I know, just working with people that have not had a lot of familiarity with firearms, you don't want to put 5 or 6 people out on a line that are brand new shooters and then have them do some sort of dynamic exercises of move and shoot. That's going to be trouble, because they get all involved and they forget muzzle awareness. And next thing you know, they're pointing a gun at their friend, and then you get a finger on the trigger, a negligent discharge. Well, that's one of the U.S. Army works at that. In fact, the range where I go is owned by a retired Delta Force operator. And he told us his first month as a Delta Force operator in training, they only let them dry fire their AR-15. They had to practice loading, unloading, dry firing, and that means you're pressing the trigger without actually firing a live round. They did that for a month. Why? Because they wanted to instill that it became second nature, that if your gun is not pointed at something you intend to shoot, you get the safety off. When you come up, the safety goes on. The safety goes off. Down, safety on. Up, safety off. And they drilled and drilled and drilled. That's what we're talking about for these guys. Because if you don't do that, then they get into a combat situation, which you've been in. And when the explosions are going off and the guns are firing, people sometimes get a little panicked. And they sometimes revert to do at the lowest level what they remember. And that's why you hope that in that 18-month period, you can give people some taste of that. And usually it's still never enough that once they confront the reality, a lot of the training goes out the door.
Yeah. And you're seeing Gary highlight there. This is just from 2 days ago, 3 days ago. They're going to try and boost to 2 months. But he even said this, even if they get it, that's still, way below the minimum. That is 6 to 9. And of course, that's just for individual soldiers, not for a unit, which does require 18 months really as if you want to actually succeed in modern combat. So that just shows you how far. Again, we always go back to ground truth reality. These are from the words of the sides themselves. This is the Ukrainian side here. But now let me jump back to Zelensky because so I just showed you what he said last night. So literally hours ago. Here's what was said after Trump had won, and the Fox News went over to interview Zelensky and ask him some pretty hard questions, one of which had to do with money and support from Trump.
You said the U.S. can't force you to sit at the negotiating table. What if the U.S. government cuts military funding to Ukraine?
If they will cut, I think we will lose. Of course, anyway, we will stay, we will fight. We have our production, but it's not enough to prevail. And I think it's not enough to survive. But that will be, if such choice will be American choice. So we will decide what we will have to do.
Okay, that was, I think it said the 19th of November. Trump has said nothing to contradict that. He is going to, when asked specifically, will you cut aid? Yes. Point blank, yes. Everything in the Kellogg plan, whether it's realistic or not, is negotiated, is designed to bring the war to a negotiated end, period. So then why is Zelensky, when he acknowledges if the money goes down, we will lose, then say, but we'll keep fighting anyway? That seems to me to be really dangerous delusion.
Yeah. No, it is. And we've got actually a visual evidence of how out of touch with reality he is. He knows that Donald Trump is coming in. Trump is a guy that likes suits, white shirts, red ties, okay? Zelensky still is dressing up in, pre-Che Guevara outfits and, thinks he's Fidel Castro. If I would be saying, hey, there's a change taking place if every time you saw Zelensky shave the beard, had a clean suit on, looked like Jelani in Syria. He's got the Brooks Brothers suit on, and he's got the white shirt and a red tie, maybe an orange tie, rocking something powerful, in order to suck up the Trump, because that's one of the things they train you when you're out as a case officer trying to recruit spies is how to mirror body language. That when you're talking to somebody, there are things that you can do with your body that can either get them to imitate you or you can start imitating them, but as well to subconsciously build rapport. Well, Zelensky, by wearing his army duds, ain't building rapport with Trump, and Trump doesn't take him seriously.
Well, there's definitely no mirroring going on. That's for sure. Yeah. Speaking of Trump and what's believed in that same interview in November, Trey Yingst asked him, "Hey, Trump is wanting to end this, but how do you see it going forward and having any kind of success?" And then Zelensky, I think, exposes another level, and I hate to keep harping on this, of unreality, because he is going to argue here that Trump can convince Putin to undo his strengths that you've elaborated in the first half of the show, and that he can talk him out of it. Watch this.
Isn't Putin the only one who can make the decision to end this war?
It depends on Putin, really a lot. He can do that. He can be willing and end this war. But it also depends on the United States of America much more. Putin is weaker than the United States of America. The President of the United States of America has the strength and authorities and the weapons, and he can decrease the price for the energy resources.
I mean, how do you believe that Trump, from a hand where he's got maybe a handful of 5s and 6s and maybe a 2 or 3, is going to come in with Putin, who's got all the face cards, and convince him to just fold his hand? I don't understand the thought process there.
Yeah, well, you've got this circular reasoning going on. So Ukrainian intelligence provides CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency with the intelligence about how bad the Russian losses are. The CIA and DIA then brief Lloyd Austin and Joe Biden and Donald Trump on, boy, this is how bad Russia is. And then They take that bad information and then cycle that into their decisions, which, oh, well, all we got to do is keep doing more of the same, the more cowbell, and pump some more weapons in there, and then Russia's going to collapse. But all of it's based upon some faulty, inaccurate assumptions. And that's why, within intelligence work, you always have to be certain to identify up front, okay, what am I assuming here? And if I change those assumptions, then what would the picture look like? And so if you, in this case, if, because Zelensky is assuming, the United States is all powerful. They can they can control energy prices and therefore force Putin onto the mat and face down. And then he said, but how about if that's not true? How about, in fact, that Russia has resilience, that it's not affected by anything the United States does to it economically?
Well, and that's actually one of the next piece in here of that same interview really, I think, gets to that point here. And I specifically wanted to ask you that because in this next clip, he's going to say that he believes that the diplomacy, as he defines it, can be used by Trump and the West to isolate the Russians. Now, the context here is at the time the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz had been talking to Putin. He thought that was a terrible idea. Since that time, Robert Fico has gone even more directly to Putin into Moscow and been unequivocal that he wants to see this war end, has offered Slovakia as a neutral opportunity, a location to actually have these negotiations, etc. But you can see that Zelensky feels like that he can isolate Russia. Watch this and then comment on the backside.
Last week, you criticized German Chancellor Olaf Scholz for speaking on the phone with Russian President Putin. Why?
According to my opinion, that is really a Pandora's box. Putin's isolation is also the pressure against him. We fight not only by weapons, as you properly said, by diplomacy. Diplomacy is so important, and only diplomacy can end this war.
But, sir, how can you have diplomacy without talking?
No, we're talking. But after you know what will be soon. What Chancellor got after phone call? Nothing new.
And so your position right now is that Western leaders should not be speaking with Putin?
Intelligence of Western leaders, they had contact on the level of intelligence during this war with Russian side. They had a lot. Europe, United States, everybody they had. But it was not, against the political isolation of Putin. It was on the level of intelligence. Why? Because you have not recognized Putin as the president, because he is a killer. Otherwise, you will destroy this isolation, political isolation.
Now, real quick, before I get your commentary on that, this is what the other side, this is what Trump is saying in regards to what he recognizes on the ground.
Everyone's being killed. It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II. I've had pictures of fields where bodies are lying on top of bodies. Looks like the old pictures of the Civil War, where just bodies are all over. Just if you saw those pictures, you'd feel more strongly about it. It's got to stop.
So it's got to stop. That's 2 weeks ago. So you see Trump is saying that, and yet you still see Zelensky to this day continue to talk about isolating Russia as though he doesn't see what Trump is seeing. You talked a minute ago that Trump may be given, I don't know if skewed is the right word or not accurate intelligence, but he's getting some that is accurate, and it's leading him to the right conclusion. But you see Zelensky talking as though none of those words were ever said.
Well, I've said tongue in cheek, but there's a little bit of truth to it that Joe Biden deserves a Nobel Peace Prize for bringing Russia and China together in this long-lasting partnership. They've during the course of this special military operation and U.S. sanctions and attempts to isolate Russia, it has united Russia and China in a way that the entire U.S. foreign policy tried to prevent, going back to Henry Kissinger under Richard Nixon. That's why they had the opening to China. We wanted to split China and Russia, keep them apart. We didn't want the two to come together. Well, they've come together now, but not just diplomatically. They've come together economically. They've come together militarily, and they are working hand in hand to build up BRICS and other international organizations. They've become the leaders in the global south, and the number of countries in the global south that are flocking to join BRICS and to move away and separate from the West, it's growing. It's not diminishing. I went to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum last June. There were 36 different countries there. Russia's not isolated at all. Yeah. And the one thing that these people out of Africa, out of Asia, out of South America, they find in Russia respect. Russia doesn't treat them like they're some colonial toy that Russia owns, that Russia has to be condescending to them. No, the Russians are very fair and equitable in dealing with these people. They deal with them as adults. So the fact that Zelensky doesn't get that is part of the problem. And he's saying that stuff at the very moment that he's becoming more isolated within Europe. The Europeans aren't lining up saying, by God, we need to support this Zelensky at any price. Poland's sort of saying, wait a second. Slovakia, Hungary, Austria saying, nope, they're not going to do it. So it's running in the wrong direction for Zelensky.
Right. And one more level of that to discuss. So that clip I just showed you from Trump on the 17th, I think it was, of December, saying it's got to end because of all this bloodshed. So he sees there's no military path to success there. The next day, Zelensky actually talked about how he wants to negotiate a settlement, but as long as I don't have to give anything up.
We cannot give up our territories. The Ukrainian constitution forbids us to do so, but we do not have the strength to recover them. We can only count on diplomatic pressure from the international community to force Putin to sit down at the negotiating table.
Force Putin to negotiate. You obliterated your offensive capacity in 2023, broke the teeth, broke the bones on it, and now it's been nothing but a retreat ever since that time. Russia has, and you already laid this out, so I won't repeat it, all the things they have improved and increased and continue to increase on all the categories that go into successful national war making. And he's saying that we're not going to give up our territory. We want to force through diplomatic means. I just keep going back to this. How can, as a Ukrainian person, when they hear this kind of thing, how can they keep putting confidence in this guy and keep sending troops to the forward when they see it's totally divorced from reality?
Well, he has his political support has virtually vanished. He's being kept in office by a small group of oligarchs that are tied to this neo-Nazi theology. Is the only way I can describe it. And let's not forget, in March, April of 2022, there was an agreement on the table from Russia that Russia was going to permit that Donetsk, Luhansk, those oblasts would stay as part of Ukraine. They simply, all Russia wanted was a protection for the Russian speakers, that their rights would no longer be violated, that they would not be subject to discrimination or attack. And it was Zelensky that walked away from that, under pressure, of course, from the United States and Great Britain. But he walked away from that, not Russia. So, this, you make your bed, you lie in it. He's made his bed, and it's a short bed of nails is all I can say.
Listen, we're running a little low on time here, but there's a couple things I definitely want to hit to. All these realities we've been talking about: battlefield, diplomatic, international realities, political realities. Everything is firmly concluded the war can't be won, and yet yesterday the Zelensky put out this really strange tweet. And look, I get you want to be optimistic and positive. But he says that our 2024, you rolled too far down there, Gary. Every single day that has been won by our warriors and our people, everyone who defends and works and strengthens. Then he says a little further down, we Ukrainians know what it means not to wait for tomorrow, but to fight for every single day and year of our freedom. And 2024 was exactly that. A year hard won and free, and another step towards our justice, fair peace, and a victory in a lifetime without war. What in the God's name can you mean by 2024 when it's nothing but losses to say that? It boggles the mind.
He's a comedian with a bad comedy writer. He's certainly not a mathematician. because all he had to do is add up the body counts from the dead and wounded. 546,000 dead in 2024 compared to, it was like 520,000 that had died and wounded in the previous 2 years. So really twice as many died in 1 year as in the previous 2 years. And that trend, they're on a path to continue to repeat that pattern. So he doesn't get it. He's not counting.
And in fact, when Doug McGregor on our show has pointed out many times in his study of military history and wars of centuries gone by, he said that the end of wars often have the highest number of casualties for the failure because they just can't stop fighting, and they're just trapped in this cycle that they just can't escape from, and whatever. When you look at and the last thing I want to point out here. So to your point there, the Kursk salient is being slowly and methodically squeezed down. It won't be, it may even be within a month, potentially, that they could knock that out. Karakova, that we've talked about here many times, has fallen overnight. The Russians took the last part of that, which means they're closing in on Pokrovsk. You have Pokrovsk, Torets, Chasiv Yar, all in their death throes. Every single place you want to look is continuing to go, and the Ukrainian army goes down. Then on top of all that, with all of that knowledge, with all of that math, as you talked about a second ago, with all of these body counts just hours ago, Zelensky points to this as his motivation.
Danny, what are we looking for? What am I looking for?
The last one about Zelensky from last night.
God saw it. He saw what kind of people we have, what kind of children we have, and I will never forget those incredibly mature and strong eyes of the boy from Okhmadit. How much life is in him, energy and dignity. And how much stronger this child alone is than Putin. How much stronger all our children are than their entire evil. Ukrainian boys and girls who are winning this war, gaining knowledge online and even in underground schools, winning global science competitions, raising funds for our army, and inventing technological solutions that help with our defense. You are a phenomenal generation. This is who we are fighting for. This is who our heroes, our warriors, protect above all. Those who stand firm and carry independence on their shoulders, where freedom and valor fight every day, even now on this New Year's night, on all fronts, on all of them, in the East, where it is extremely difficult and challenging right now, but we believe, we know, you will stand strong.
That is the worst part to me, because he talks about his people and he talks about his men, both of which are being sacrificed to a lost past tense cause, which cannot be turned around, and anyone who is willing to just look at it can see. And all that's juxtaposed with Putin and his first one there. He's talked about his people and his troops and his people. You could just look on the ground and see they are protected. They do have a future and a hope. And Zelensky has taken what's left of his, and with these, nice videos and all these pictures of his troops he saw where they're all happy and showing flags as he's talking about how many of them are how hard it is in the East. We don't have time to show it now, but Gary has found a couple of recent interviews with some of those soldiers who looked shell-shocked that they can. I mean, they had the literal 1,000-yard stare. Their voice as trailing off as they're talking about the horrific carnage, and that's common among those people. And instead of saying, "Okay, let's stop the carnage today," because he can. He's the one. Putin can either win militarily or agree to negotiate it if and only if Zelensky recognizes reality and saves his people. If he cares about them, this is the one thing that he can do in this late hour to stop the carnage, is to finally acknowledge reality. And if he doesn't, Larry, then how many more people we've seen on that screen right there are going to end up being in graves?
Yeah, I think that's why he's going to be taken out by his own people. Through a military coup. I will be shocked if Zelensky survives to see 2026. I think 2025 will be his last year of life on Earth, and it's because of that kind of delusion. He doesn't have the advantage that Adolf Hitler had, who had a very charismatic personality and had control over people. and had a loyalty to him. Zelensky doesn't have that same kind of loyalty, and he's an expendable type. And at some point, when the cost to the Ukrainian military is going to be seen as so great, so significant, that Zelensky will become an expendable at that point. And it doesn't. As you said, the facts on the ground from a tactical standpoint, just they don't. There's no way you can manipulate those in any other direction but to point to Russia's going to win this. It's just a matter of when.
And at what cost? Well, listen, I'm sorry we have to wrap up real quick because we got to roll off here. We're going to bring back to everybody here at 3:30 p.m. today, by the way, an update on this terror attack in New Orleans. There's been some breaking information. There's apparently a press conference that's going to start any minute if it hadn't already started, where they're going to give the latest information. We'll give you a breakdown of exactly what's going on and what we know up to this point at 3:30 today. Don't want to miss that. We'll talk to you very soon. And thanks again to Larry Johnson. We'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.
Thank you.